11 years ago I made a video about this milk crate inspired box, and I want to build more boxes like that, and because last time the video quality was awful, I thought I'd film it again. As usual, I'm starting with some 2x4 type lumber. Here's some 2x6s, and I planed that first, and here I'm cutting the pieces to width because I don't need the whole piece. And I don't need the whole thickness either, so I'm using my table saw to cut that down because I want the scraps. Alright, got enough cut out to make two of these. These will be slightly rectangular, so I'll have some long sides and short sides. And then on the bottom, these are a little bit narrower. And all of these offcuts that I made, those will form the slats here, because those don't need to be very thick. I cut out parts of my 1-to-1 templates to make a story stick for where to cut the mortises in these pieces with my slot mortiser. So now I can just use my story stick to set the position for the first mortise for the slats. I'm using that same stop setting to cut the first mortise in all 16 pieces. And now setting the stop for the next position and cut them all again. I had to clamp an extension to my slot mortiser to set the stop position for the next slots. For mortises, I like to make a series of plunge cuts and then route between them. That way there's less sideways forces on the bit, so I get less bit deflection and more precision. Got 88 mortises cut, and I cut all my scraps into these pieces, which will form the slats. And cutting those to length, because they're all short pieces, it's relatively easy to work around the knot holes. I want to cut some tenons on the end of these slats to go in here with the panther router, and it turns out this template is actually almost the exact size that I need. If I had thought this through ahead of time, I would have checked this template to make sure it matches exactly. So I've already actually made this template, which is about 1 millimeter wider than this one, to cut those tenons. I need to cut 88 tenons on the ends of these pieces, and I've already got my panther router set up, and this time I actually set up a backstop so that I can swap these without stopping the router, because usually I use the router bit as a front stop, and I have it centered vertically, and for the first time I actually use this feature here where you just stick your piece of wood in between this part and this part here, and that centers the middle groove on here right on the workpiece. So now I've cut the tenon on one end of all my work pieces, and I could just flip them over and use the same stop to cut the one on the other end, but that doesn't ensure maximum consistency in terms of shoulder to shoulder length. So what I'll do instead is I'll change the stop to reference the shoulder that I previously cut, and that will ensure maximum consistency in terms of shoulder to shoulder length. So that made for quite a bit of shavings, and I didn't even use the dust collection thingy on this thing, which actually works quite well. But I was standing in the airstream coming from my air cleaner, so I'm actually standing in the wind and I wasn't breathing the dust coming off of this thing. So these pieces are all going to fit into these mortises, and that'll form the sides of the box like this. But before I do that, I need to round the edges of these things here, and I figure I can do both the top and bottom edge of these if I just use a round over bit against the side like so. Got all my sides glued up. Now I need to cut handle holes in some of them. And for that, I'm going to use my other panther router. And I already have a piece clamped in here. And I made a template to trace out the shape of that handle. Now I need to join these sides to these sides using box joints at the corner, and this time I'm going to make them a little bit coarser this size, in fact, using my screw advance box joint jig. And for the slot I've got 2 saw blades side by side, and the increment on the jig that works best for that is the 25 tooth against the 12 tooth and 3 turns per increment. Ideally, I'd be using a 37 tooth gear, but with all the gears that I've got, I haven't made one of those yet. So that'll work best, so now I just need to go ahead and cut those. That's a little tighter than I would like it. I cut all the short sides by putting 2 sides in the jig at a time, but it's a lot of cranking, so this time I'm just going to put all 4 sides in the jig at once. And I was afraid that I might lose count on this thing, having to turn 3 times per cut, so I made a pencil mark at the start, and then for every increment there's another little tick mark, because if I were to be 1 turn off, that tick mark would be way off compared to this. Now for these ones, I need to offset these by half of an increment, so 1.5 turns. So to get that extra half turn, I need to back this gear off, turn it by half, and mesh it again. So my new starting position is here, and this one's no longer valid. To make the joints fit not quite so tight, I'm cutting forward and then advancing the gear just a little bit before I do the backstroke. And that way on the backstroke I cut a little bit more off the side of the slot, which makes for a looser fit. Now I can see what this box is going to look like. I still need to make a groove to attach the bottom, which is going to be this type of plywood. And for that I'm going to cut some slots using, again, 2 blades stacked. I'm just getting ready to glue these pieces together, but I'm curious how strong this box joint is, so let me just break it. The glue's only been drying for maybe an hour. Well, it only broke one of the pieces of wood, but again, the glue is probably not fully dried yet. I'm just giving the joints a brief squeeze with a big clamp, and that's just to seat them all the way down. They don't really need clamping to dry. I find it necessary to say this every time. You don't need to give plywood room for expansion for a bottom of a box like that. It's much better to glue it in, because that gives extra strength to the box. And it's a bit stressful gluing big joints like that, because if I don't work fast enough, the glue can set on me before the joints are fully seated. And once again, I'm using a big clamp to force the joints fully seated. I like to put sawdust on the excess glue, not so much to absorb it, but it makes it less gooey when I scrape it off, and that makes less of a mess. I rounded the corners of the box by making 2 cuts from different angles with a table saw and then rounding it on the belt sander. I could have used a router, but I was too afraid that it might cause tear out. But I did use a router to round the along the grain edges, less risk of tear out that way, though I routed backwards just to make sure I wasn't going to get tear out. And here's the boxes all done. Now these are going to be for the kids, and I thought the bottom might not be strong enough, so I added another layer of plywood to the bottom. And I figured it would also be nice to engrave their names on the sides. And for that, I'm going to use my pantograph. And I was just trying it out. Here's my pattern. Here's one of the names engraved in a test piece. Taking a while to figure out how to rig this up, but I think I'm finally ready to start engraving names in those boxes. That's not bad. Well, that was a crazy amount of work for a couple of boxes, but I think the kids will really enjoy them. And one of the reasons they're rectangular like this is because I figure the kids will probably use them to build houses, and that way they get a little bit more height.